What are creative modes in photography and what are the other modes? Hi and welcome to episode 107 of the Photography Explained podcast. I'm your host Rick, and in each episode I will try to explain one photographic thing to you in plain English in less than 10 minutes-ish without the irrelevant details. What I tell you is based on my lifetime of photographic experience and not Google. And breathe. Now before I go on, I need your help. I need your questions to answer. More on this at the end. Here is the answery bit. Creative modes in photography are aperture priority, shutter priority, manual and program modes. In these modes, the photographer can change most, if not all, of the camera settings. The other modes are called basic modes, which have picture styles for different types of photos and a limited choice of camera settings to change. Okay, now let me explain. Now I want to start off with an apology, but I'm talking here about how Canon do things. Now I'm sure that other camera manufacturers have similar setups and the principles will apply to all camera systems. But I'm a Canon user and that's what I know, and my podcast is telling you what I know, so I hope that's okay with you. There are two broad image capture modes, creative modes and basic modes. Creative modes allow the photographer to change most of the camera settings. I say most, if not all, for a reason. Let's quickly look at the four creative modes and then the basic modes. In all the creative modes, the photographer sets the ISO, which is the sensitivity of the camera sensor to light. Aperture priority, or aperture value, as Canon call it. I've always known it as aperture priority, to be honest with you, because you're giving aperture the priority, and I think that's what it used to be called. Anyway, aperture priority, aperture value, AV, they're all the same. There you go, first bit of learning for us. You set the aperture, and the camera sets the shutter speed. Now you can change anything on your camera using this mode, apart from the shutter speed that the camera selects to give you the correct exposure for the aperture and ISO set by you, the photographer. That was a bit of a long sentence I wrote there. I need to try harder on my notes. Yes, this is scripted, would you believe? As I said, this is also known as aperture value and has the designation AV on Canon cameras. Shutter priority, or shutter value. Well, this is the same as aperture priority, or value, but this time you select the shutter speed and the camera selects the aperture to give you the correct exposure. Manual mode. You select everything. Aperture, shutter, and everything else. So in manual mode, you can change everything. A quick word on the exposure triangle. Now these camera settings that we are changing adjust the exposure that we get and are of course determined using the exposure triangle, which, let us remind ourselves, is the relationship between aperture, shutter and ISO, which you need to get correct to get a correct exposure. Unless you're using program, that's program mode, sorry. Now I spelt this for many years PROGRAMME, but I only found out recently that there's no ME on the end. It's just program with an M. Oh well, good to know, good to learn. In program mode, the camera selects the aperture and shutter to give you the correct exposure. Okay, so that's the four creative modes. So, basic modes, or as my notes say, basic zones. Now, when I say basic modes, I'm talking about these. Well, these are the ones my Canon 6D has anyway. They are Scene Intelligent Auto, Creative Auto. I've written audio. Now, I need to say here that I took time and care over these notes, so these errors are a moderate concern. I'm going to start again. Basic modes. When I say basic modes, I'm talking about these. Well, these are the ones that my Canon 6D has. Scene Intelligent Auto, Creative Auto, not Creative Audio as I've written, Special Scene, Portrait, Landscape, Close-Up, Sports, Night Portrait, Handheld Night Scene, HDR Backlight Control. Okay, there's some interesting stuff in there then that needs looking at. The talky bit. Well, why are there so many different modes? Well, I've spoken at length about this, so check out the previous episodes of my podcast and I'll mention these at the end. The creative modes give the photographer more control over the camera settings than the basic modes. Now I've decided that I'm going to go into each of these in more detail, so next episode will be about the creative modes and why you might use each of them or not. Up to you. And then I'm going to do the same for the basic modes in the episode after. Now I listed those earlier, but I have to tell you I've never used many of these, so I needed a bit of work on them, find out a bit more. Well, I want to understand them myself so I can explain them to you better. And you never know, I might find something there that is for me. But why so many camera modes? Well, there are many variables in photography, and people have different levels of technical ability, as well as different levels of interest in such stuff. If you want to use landscape mode to photograph landscapes, and portrait mode to take portraits, then that's just fine. I don't mind repeating myself. I'd rather that people made the best use of the technology available to them to help them take photos, rather than be put off by manual mode. You know what I'm saying here. We've all seen gurus, yes, I'm using air quotes here, gurus who tell us that to be real photographers we have to use manual mode. Nonsense, we don't. These different camera modes are here to help people take photos. These different modes have been created for a reason, and that reason is to help people take photos. So they're not a bad thing, they're a good thing which should be recognised. Now, I've mentioned photography snobbery before, haven't I? Just go to rickmcavoyphotography.com/photography-snobbery and you'll see what I'm talking about. That wasn't in my notes, that was an ad-lib then. An ad-lib plug for me. Well, why not? It's my podcast after all, isn't it? Sure, I hope that everyone learns how to use manual mode and fully understand the exposure triangle, but we have to remember one thing. Now, not everyone is interested in this stuff, and that's fine. What is photography? Well, photography, after all, is drawing with light. So if program mode is your preferred way of taking photos, of creating new things, then that's just fine. As I said, it's better that than not doing it because you've been told you have to use manual mode but you don't understand it. And this does happen to people. People read this stuff from experts and they're intimidated. They don't feel valid or justified as photographers because they're not using manual mode. They don't understand it, they struggle with it, and they give up on photography. And that is the last thing that we want. So if these basic modes, because they're not that basic, let's be honest with you, if these get people enjoying photography, then what's not to love? We should be celebrating them, not criticising them. As I nearly said vilifying them then, but I'm not 100% sure that that's correct in this context. We'll stick with criticise, I know that word quite well. Well, I would, wouldn't I, being me? And if after all these episodes you're still not sure about this stuff, please get in touch. Tell me what you're not sure of, and I'll give you a whole episode to answer your question or questions. And of course, if I do that, you will get a shout out on that episode as well. How splendid. Other camera settings. Well, what do I mean by other camera settings? Well, I mean the ones that aren't mentioned in the creative zone modes, which are aperture, shutter, priority. There's loads of other ones. So if you check out episode 105, I'll tell you 20 camera settings that I use. And I'll also list out the other ones about the different types of camera settings. I've already covered this. This is getting to the end of stuff on camera settings, which I've really enjoyed doing. But the point here is that in the basic modes, you can't change as many of the settings as you can in the creative modes. Nowhere near as many. And yes, there are so many camera settings, so that's another reason why they're good if you're starting out in photography, because there's less things for you to do. And in manual mode, you can change everything. As I said, in aperture value mode, you can change everything apart from the shutter speed that the camera picks. And in shutter priority or shutter value mode, the same, but the camera picks the aperture. You get the idea. And in the basic modes, you can set a few things yourself. Now, for my Canon 6D, there is a table in the camera manual that shows you these. Now, camera manual, I'm glad I mentioned that. When I'm talking about creative modes in photography and the other modes and what they all mean and what they do, what I am asking you to do for your own sake is this. That camera manual thing, you should get one with your camera. And all this stuff is explained there. It's in there somewhere, but it's in a factual, non-fun kind of way. That's what I'm here for. So it's written straight and cold like an encyclopedia, but that's fine. It's an instruction manual. It's not meant to be entertaining. Now, I know there's a lot to get through, but I strongly recommend that you go through your camera manual, if only once, and find out all that you can about these camera settings. Now, whatever your ability level, I bet you'll find something in there that you didn't know. I found all sorts of stuff about my Canon 6D when I actually went through all 402 pages. Yes, 402 pages of the manual, which I have in PDF format on my PC, phone and iPad. Yes, it really is 402 pages, but on the plus side, they're small pages. But yes, I really did do that. What do I do? Well, I use AV mode, aperture value, aperture priority. Call it what you want, they're all the same thing. You set the ISO, remember, so you select an aperture, the aperture that you want for the photo that you're taking, and the camera selects the correct shutter speed to give you the correct exposure according to the camera meter. Big takeaway, use whatever you're comfortable with to take photos. If you are more comfortable, use the basic modes, but look at the results you get and learn at your own pace what the camera is doing. And I'm going to add to that away from my notes. Learn manual mode. At the very least, learn how to use it and practice it. You don't have to use it all the time. But if you learn manual mode and understand it, you will have a very good foundation knowledge of the exposure triangle, which is one of the fundamentals of photography. So it will stand you in good stead for as long as you're into photography. It really will, trust me. But if you're happy using program mode and you don't want to go any further, that is just fine. Okay? I did say I was going to stop saying okay so much. I've tried to cut so out of my scripts. Well, not my scripts really. I write a script. I don't write so at the beginning of every sentence. It's just that when I'm reading this stuff out and recording it, so appears all over the place, which isn't great. Related episodes. Well, there's plenty of good stuff you can catch up on if you missed it. Check out episodes 100 to 106. Yep, I'm on a bit of a roll here. These are all about camera settings. We've got why there's so many camera settings. Camera settings 1, things you can set and forget. Camera settings 2, things that you might want to change when out taking photos. Camera settings 3, the things that you set for each photo you take. 10 camera settings for beginners. Let's keep things nice and simple. And do you want to know the 20 camera settings that I use? And let's not forget the last episode. Program mode. What is it? Is it okay for me to use it? The answer was yes, by the way. Next episode, sandwiched in between episode 106 and 108, is this splendid episode about creative modes. But where am I going next? Well, we're just going to talk about creative modes, aren't we? I'm going to tell you all about creative modes. Now, I've not come up with a title yet, I'm going to be honest with you, but I will have one before I record the episode. Shout out time. Shout out to me. Well, why not? Okay, get your question answered. Slight change in the order of my podcast. I put this at the end, so I'll give you the stuff that you want to hear first to explain the question and stick this stuff at the end, and if you're still here, hopefully you'll act on it. Get your question answered. This is what my podcast is all about, answering your photography questions. So please get in touch with your question, and not only will I answer your question, but I will give you a shout out on that episode, which will be nice. And better than me giving me a shout out. Just head over to photographyexplainedpodcast.com/start. Okay, I'm done. Thank you very much for listening to my small but perfectly formed podcast, it says here. To find out more about my podcast and do stuff to help me, check out the podcast website, photographyexplainedpodcast.com. Brought to you by, well, this episode was brought to you by me. I've been Rick McAvoy. Thanks again very much for listening to me and for giving me 10-ish minutes of your valuable time. At which point I need to say, if you're listening to an older episode and I've said 12 3/4 minutes and it's only 9 1/4 minutes, that's because I've edited the episode. That's that one explained. So this episode, I don't know how long it's going to be because I'm going to edit out the rubbish. Hopefully it's not too much. Thank you again for listening, and I will see you on the next episode. Cheers from me, Rick.